So for those of you who don't know, I am a huge tea drinker, and from what I understand, that is not something that is unique about me. And one day, when I was sitting down having my daily cup of tea, I had an idea. I looked at my tea bag, thought about it for a second, then I realized I had a lot of mismatched fabric and small cuts stashed away, and I was thinking, I bet I could do something with that extra scrappy fabric that involves my love of tea. So I moseyed on over to my stash, and I know I am not the first person to come up with this idea of a tea protector, tea envelope thing. I know I got the idea from somewhere, but I still wanted to take a crack at it. So I went through my stash and I picked out a variety of fabric. I picked out whatever I thought might be cute and I might be able to work together, so that I could later match them all up and see if there was anything that would look really good together. I also made a trip to, it's not really a project graveyard, I haven't quite buried this yet. It's more like the morgue. Like the project's dead, but not quite buried yet. So then I sat down, with my tea of course, and flipped through all of my fabric, putting together an outer layer and a lining that I thought would complement each other. Now you might be wondering, Sam, why? Well, I'm a bit of a tea snob, and sometimes when I go to restaurants, they don't have good tea, but they will almost always have hot water. So now it is time to do a little bit of measuring and a little bit of math to draft my pattern. So I grabbed a bunch of tea bags and little tea packets from brands that I either drink a lot of and like to have on me, or have different shapes and different sizes. So I measured them all, and in this measuring process I realized that most of my tea bags would all fit in a little pocket that is 3 inches long by 3.5 inches tall. So that is what I ultimately decided on and based all of my measurements for the little envelope off of. So after doing a little bit of math and trying to figure some things out, I came up with this idea of a larger 4-pocket envelope, and here are my measurements for that. And I'm also working on a smaller 2-pocket variation, which I will be making out of a cactus and succulent print fabric. So in case you see, try not to get confused with both of them. Hi, Editing Sam here. I didn't leave enough time for me to properly read out all of my measurements, so for accessibility's sake, I'm going to audibly read out all of my pieces, and also just in case you can't read my handwriting, I've been told my entire life that it's atrocious, so yeah. So for this larger one with the 4 pockets, you are going to need, made of your outside fabric, a 7-inch long by 9-inch tall piece of fabric. You are also going to need one piece of that out of your lining fabric, so that's 7 inches wide by 9 inches tall. Then you are going to need 2 pocket little pieces, and those are 7 inches long by 5 inches tall, so you're going to need 2 of those of your lining fabric. Then you are going to need 4 inner flaps, little things, and those are 4-inch by 4-inch squares, so you're going to need 4 of those out of your lining fabric, or whatever fabric, honestly. And then for the outer flap, which is optional, but I do recommend it, you are going to need a 4-inch long by 9 inches tall piece of fabric, and you're only going to need 1 of those. So then for the smaller variation, which is the one with 2 pockets, you are going to need of your outside fabric a 7 inches long by 5 inches tall piece of fabric. You are also going to need that for the lining and the pocket. That is the same measurement, so that is 7 inches long by 5 inches tall. You're going to wind up with 3 total pieces of that measurement. Then for the inner flaps, they're the same size as on the other one. You have 4-inch by 4-inch squares, and you are going to need 2 of those. And then for the outer flap, again optional, but I do recommend it, it is 4 inches long by 5 inches tall, and you're going to cut out 1 of those. Thanks, Editing Sam. So the fabric that I initially wanted to use and iron was this pretty little quilting cotton, and another piece of mint, what I thought was quilting cotton, but it turns out to be mostly polyester, so I accidentally melted that, so I had to go back and figure out a different piece of fabric to use for my lining, which I wound up using that cherry blossom print you can see at the top of the screen. And I'm just demonstrating how I cut out all of these pieces. I didn't make any sort of master pattern. I just took my little quilting ruler and measured things out and drew them out and cut them. So you don't really need to necessarily do the inner flaps. I just wanted to put them in because when you're carrying around tea on you in little tea bags, you're probably carrying around in either a suitcase or a purse, or something that the little pocket might be flapping around and moving around, and without that flap I was worried about little tea envelopes falling out, and I was getting a little hangry at this point, so I took a macaroni and cheese break. So now I have all of my pieces cut out, and the first thing I'm going to do is work on the flaps. Now I'm going to be working on a lot of these two tea envelopes simultaneously, so if you get confused, just flowers is the big one, cactus are the small one. So the first thing I'm going to do is pin the flaps right sides together, and I'm going to sew along the short edges, and I'm going to sew with a 1/2 inch seam allowance. And then for the long outer flap, I'm going to fold that, what is that, hot dog style? And same thing, I am going to sew along the edge with a 1/2 inch seam allowance. Now, I'm doing some of these with a straight seam allowance, and I'm doing some of these with a curved one or a pointed one, and that just goes to show you that you really can customize this as much as you want. So if you're doing the straight, kind of squared seams, you can go ahead and properly stitch that down, but if you are doing anything curved or bringing it in to have a point on it, then I would recommend basting them shut first, and that way things are nice and flat and they won't be shifting around as you're moving and manipulating the fabric under the needle. I would also recommend sewing these from fold to outer side. I hope that makes sense. And that's just so hopefully everything will lay nice and flat and you don't accidentally twist things, so you'll be folding or sewing from the fold out. So here I am properly stitching on a shorter stitch length the cherry blossom flap pieces because I want these to be nice and square. Also keep in mind when you're cutting and pinning and sewing these flaps that some of these there is one direction that is going to have to face up, so if you're kind of working with a fabric that doesn't have a strict up or a down, you might need to play around a little bit and make sure that whatever way you orient it when you turn it right side out, you're going to have at least one nice side that you are going to want to see from the outside. So now I'm going to clip all of these, and for the ones that I just basted, I'm giving a really quick light iron. I'm not doing any heavy pressing, and this is just to help the cotton kind of stick to itself and stay put, so that when I put this under the sewing machine and when I round out some of these curves and to the points, it's just going to help everything stick together and not slide around. So right now I am clipping the corners of my nice square rectangular corner flaps, and this is how I marked my curves. So I marked, I made a mark 1 inch in on the long side. No, it was 1.5 inches in from the long side and 1 inch down from the fold, and then I just kind of eyeballed the curve. For this long piece, I made a mark 2 inches in on the long side and then 1 inch down, and I just kind of roughly drew out a curve. It's not going to be perfect, but that's okay. And for these pointed ones that are going to look like little envelope tops, I marked the center on the fold, and I marked 1 inch up, and I just connected the dots. And here you see me stitching and just following the line. Now ideally, again, you would sew from corner to, or from fold to the outer edge, but I'm lazy and wanted to avoid chain stitch, or avoid having to uncut and recut things. So now I'm just showing you how I clipped my curves and clipped my corners so that I would have nice sharp edges and nice clean curves. So my next step was to turn everything right side out, and I took a mechanical pencil with the graphite fully withdrawn, and I used that to poke all of my corners to make sure they were nice and sharp. I also ran that along the seam. Hello? Huh?
I just needed you to know how much better it is than whipped cream in the house.
Oh, okay. I'll take your word for it.
Talking am fine.
Like I was saying, by the way, that was so Steen in the background. Like I was saying, I took that pencil and pressed it along the seam line to make sure that I had it nice and open. Now, this part, so I wound up figuring out a much better way of doing this, so I cut most of it out. And I will show you at the end. So this part stayed pretty much the same. So I made a pencil mark on my pocket pieces. These are the long, 5x9 piece, I think. So I made a mark a ½ inch down on the top, from the top of both of these, and I quickly finger pressed it over, folded it down, and then pressed it over one more time, and that is just to create kind of this nicely finished top edge, so that all the raw edges are hidden. So I finger pressed that real quick because quilting cotton behaves. And on one of the pockets, you don't want to do this on both of them, just do it on one. You are going to turn the bottom up by ½ inch as well. And the reason for that is one of these is going to be on top, and the other one is going to have the raw edge neatly encased in the seam allowance of the entire thing. So it'll make sense later. Now, I had been working on this project for a while, and it didn't quite turn out well, so I decided to sleep on it. And right before I fell asleep, I came up with a much better idea on how to put all of this together. So I looked at my previous attempts that I made the night before, that they were all right, and you're gonna see the finishing process on them. But, yeah, I figured out a better way to do it. And you know how sometimes ideas work out better in your head than in real life? But the more I thought about it, I thought this would work in real life. So I recut out all my pieces, except my outer flap. I accidentally cut out 2 inches too short because I was rushing, but I recut everything out, and I put everything together for the most part exactly the same. I did add a little bit of extra seaming on the flaps for this part, and that's mainly just for decoration at this point. I also added some extra lines of stitching on my pockets. Again, same thing, just a little bit extra decoration. So this is the outer flap. So now I figured out a much better way to put everything together, because previously it was too much. It was just too much. So for this method, we're going to do a lot of marking and measuring. So for the flaps, we are going to measure a ½ inch from the top, which should be an 1.5 inches from the folded edge, and we're going to make a straight line across there, and we're going to do that on all 4 flaps. And then once we have that done, we are going to make a series of marks across the lining fabric. So you are going to lay out your pocket and make a mark 1/2 inch above the top of the pocket. Just quick little mark. And then you should be doing this, measuring this out at a 1/4 inch above that mark. I did not measure that properly, which is why it didn't work out well. But you are going to place the folded edge of your top pocket 1/4 inch above the mark that you just made, and then you are going to make another mark 1/2 inch above that pocket line. So at this point, I am making a quick mark down the center of the pouch, and now you are going to match up the flaps along the line that you just drew. And then to sew, you are going to start from the bottom up. So you're going to sew the very bottom, then you are going to sew the flaps on top of for the lower pocket, then you're going to sew that folded edge down on top of the flaps of the upper pocket, and then you're going to sew the flaps for the upper pocket. I hope that made sense. And then once that is done, everything should be neatly enclosed. You shouldn't see any raw edges that shouldn't be there and won't be fixed later. So now we have to seal off the pockets themselves. So you're going to sew from the bottom up. What is that, a 1/4 inch? Yeah, a 1/4 inch seam allowance on the right side, straight down the center, and then on the left side. So now you are going to attach the outer flap. That is going to help keep the entire thing closed. It's a little small, but it's okay. And remember, whatever side you want, flap side you want on the outside to be visible on the outside, have that facing up towards you. Now you are going to lay your outer fabric on top and sew with a 1/4 inch seam allowance all the way around. Make sure you leave a little space to turn it in, and in order to keep the flaps from getting caught in the seam allowance, I just kind of folded them under real quick and used a pin to fold it and tuck it out of the way. Wills, do you have something you want to say? Mom's a little busy. So I quickly finished this off with a button, and now we're about to jump back to the other footage of me finishing up the other envelopes because I filmed that much better. Alright, so in order to do the small one, it's kind of like combining the bottom of the bottom pocket and the top of the top pocket. So here that is nice and done, and you can see a little bit of what I tried to do earlier with the little pocket flaps, and I had things folded into themselves and I had to stitch them on later, and it was a lot. So here I am reassembling the cherry blossom and flower one, the big one. This really just proves that you really need to do a couple practice runs, because things work out a lot better in your head than they do in real life, and sometimes even if things do kind of work out, then there's almost always a way to improve it. So this was the first time that I was putting this together, and you can see me kind of struggling with the pinning, and I'm doing my best to make sure that I am not sewing through any of the flaps. And I'm sewing this with a nice, this one wound up being a 1/4 inch seam allowance instead of a full 1/2 inch seam allowance. So then I clipped my corners to make sure they would turn nice and sharp, and then I very carefully, because there are pins in there, very carefully turned the entire thing right side out. And the next step in finishing it is to give it a nice press after you have turned and poked all the corners out as far as they would go. So we gave this a very nice press, and then I went and I stitched around because we had to sew up that little hole in the bottom, and also to keep things nice and flat and from shifting around on you. I sewed as close to the edge as I could possibly get, like we're talking maybe 1/8 of an inch seam allowance all the way around, and here's what that looks like. This is a lot less defined than I thought it would be. So the last step was I decided to do a seam down the center, following that center seam that goes through all the fabric layers, and that just helps it stick together and not kind of accidentally form a bag. So, you know, this thing's all well and good, but it'll flop open if you just leave it. So there are a lot of ways you could fasten this and secure it. You could do some ribbons, so you could tie it, you can do some hooks and eyes, you can do Velcro, you can do snaps, or you can do buttons. So I decided for the smaller one I would be using this dress pant hook and bar, which probably isn't the best choice for this project, but you know, it's what I had, and that's one of the themes of this project. It's making something with the scraps and with what you have. So for these bigger one, I decided to use a button, and I think it was pretty difficult for me to choose just one button, because as you can see here, I've had a little bit of a button problem recently, in that I've acquired so many that I don't know what to do with. So I had to go through my stash and find one button, just one. And once I found that button, I used my machine to do a buttonhole stitch. Now, I would recommend, if you're going to use a button, do it on this one on the 4, because you're going to have that little gap in between the pocket that you can sew the button on, and you don't have to worry about accidentally sewing the pocket shut. So whenever you're sewing any of the fastenings, you have to be very careful to not accidentally sew the pocket shut, otherwise it'll be useless. So this 4 pocket has a nice little 1/4 inch gap or 1/2 inch gap between each pocket. If you accidentally sew the flap closed kind of at the top, it's not that big of a deal. You're still going to be able to get in and out of it, but just make sure you don't sew through the pocket. So on the smaller one, I used a hook and bar because I thought that would be easier than trying to maneuver a needle in there and sewing a button. Turned out to be about the same level of difficulty. Honestly, probably more difficult because I had to kind of blindly guess where this hole and where the attachment was supposed to be. And if you're doing this, try to get your hand in the pocket that you're sewing. Sorry, I'm recording this at like 2:30 in the morning. My brain has checked out. But if you get your hand in there, you're going to be much less likely to accidentally sew through the pocket and accidentally sew the pocket shut. So here we have the finished product. Well, of round 1. I like round 2 much better. And the most important part, it holds tea. It holds lots of tea. And once you have the tea in, the whole thing is much less floppy, and it will kind of hold its shape better, so you can just kind of toss it in your purse or toss it in a bag and you don't have to worry about everything crumpling. And you know what? It serves its purpose. And I'm happy with that. So now for all my fellow tea snobs, so when you're traveling, not that anyone really should be traveling right now, but now you have this way to protect your tea, and also to protect your bags from any spilled or ripped tea bags. And yeah, I'm gonna go sleep now. I was gonna get all dressed up cute for this, but it's cold. Well, I would like to thank you all for following me on this journey to figure out how to make some nice little tea envelopes. And I know for a fact I am not the first person to ever come up with the idea of these little travel tea protectors. I know I've gotten the idea from somewhere. I've seen a couple people do these. Well, you know how the saying goes, third time's the charm, and I think the third time really was the charm. I think I nailed down a really good way to make these. So I think these are a really fun, cute little stash busting project. You really don't need a whole lot of fabric. I know I made this one out of 2 fat quarters and I had plenty left over. I have a couple more ideas for some little DIY stash buster homemade gifts that people would actually use and might actually want coming up. So if you are interested in that, go ahead and subscribe. If you like this video and if you like this project, go ahead and give me a like. Maybe leave a comment down below if you either would like to make something like this or know somebody who would like something like this, or if you have any other ideas for some of these little stash busting projects, go ahead, leave a little comment below. Again, if you're interested in some real-time updates, go ahead and give me a follow over on Instagram over at Thread and Needlefish. I post some stories behind the scenes, a couple of little things that don't make it to YouTube. Sometimes I even put polls. I didn't do it for this one, but sometimes I put polls if I'm kind of stuck between 2 options and I let my followers vote on them. So thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed this, or I hope it was at least entertaining to watch me try to figure all of this out in real time. And hopefully I'll have a couple other videos up soon of some more little stash busting DIY gifts that you can give to people. And thanks for watching, and I will see you in the next one. In case you are curious, the tea I am drinking today is Tezo Juniper Mint Honey.